Welcome, everybody. This is Living Between Worlds for July 19th, 2023. Living Between Worlds with Grace, Dignity, and Power. We're glad to have you here. We're going to start this month. We're going to start, as we often do, big picture and somewhat philosophical, but we want to get very practical today and very action focused. A lot of you who asked about that. We see an important relationship between the big picture and the specific, between the philosophical and the action, but we'll get more explicit there today. Let me first ask you, we offered some pre-readings today. How many of you read the Rebecca Solnit article? Just show of hands real quick. So what's that? About a third, sounds like. I encourage you, if you can, to take a look at it. She is, to my mind, an extraordinarily insightful and perceptive and eloquent writer, thinker, analyst of the current, of the world we live in. Let me ask, for those of you who read it, what mood did you find yourself in as you read it or after you read it? I don't want to invite a discussion now. We'll have time for that in a bit, but just a word or two characterizing your mood, not whether you agreed or disagreed, but just sort of where you were in the course of diving into that thing. Anybody?
Felix, go ahead.
Well, I feel, for me, it really confirmed that all I need to see is a shred of hope that there's something in the future that we can get to. I don't want to hear about how hard it's going to be. It just fuels my determination. So it was extremely, she always fuels my feelings of hope and determination.
Hope and determination. Thank you. Somebody else. Manuel? Need your mic on, Manuel.
Hope and action.
Hope and action. Okay, good. And people, please, if you can, use the Zoom hand wave function, because it puts you into, it stacks you into a queue in order. Helps us manage the flow better. George?
Yeah, as I told you, I have problems with the idea of hope, but Rebecca Solnit's work, her book on paradise and emergency response, that's really, really been useful to me, and I appreciated her reiteration of that in the article.
Great, thank you for that. Solnit has a different approach to hope than the common way that's used in this culture. So that's one of the reasons I encourage you to read it. Alistair?
Yeah, so I was actually doubtful, maybe even not depressed, but yeah, doubtful, maybe of myself, or of the response in general.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? One or two more, and we'll go on.
Well, I don't find the raised hand in my reactions.
Okay. We'll take it. We'll take it.
I
live.
do have it. Oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Calling on you. What mood did it provoke for you?
Well, having just been subject to a purge out of the group that I've been involved in for 14 years, my hope was definitely under stress. And I think she gave a good sense that keep the longer view, and out of the distress can transform into better options. And I try and hold on to that.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you. Some of you are putting the mood in the chat. That's fine too. Feel free to do that if you'd rather not speak loud. Good. Okay, so Heather.
For me, it was a reminder to be careful of my attachment to expectations, good or bad.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for that. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Last month, we asked the question of what if we had to change? It's sort of a rhetorical question. We know we have to change. What if we had to turn on a dime? What if we had to change everything quickly? And, I use the example that I've often used of World War II and the American transformation of American industry in 1942. Ken reminds me, thank you, Ken, that once Japan attacked the United States, there was no powerful lobby of self-interested people saying, don't do this. That's an enormous difference between the climate crisis that we're facing. and that crisis of industrial transformation then, because we do have that now. If there's any doubt that we have to change, look at the summer fires and floods and the hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth, and even death threats against weathermen for reporting on this. And Ron DeSantis, surrounded by crazy high ocean temperatures in the Atlantic, denouncing Fireman's Fund for actually doing the actuarial math on insurance risk. Pretty crazy times. At the same time, we're hearing, even from the heart of the oil and gas industry, people saying, wait a minute, something feels different now. It's not just the business consideration, but I'm talking about individual people in the industry saying, I'm getting worried. It looks like this is really happening. What are we going to do? And it's a question that those folks are asking both personally, they live in places like Houston, Texas, as well as existentially for their industry and their careers and so forth. Did any of you have a chance to watch the Peter Zion video? Couple. For those who haven't, I encourage you to do that. He's a remarkable geopolitical analyst rooted in demographics and geography, and as well as economic factors. Very, very sobering. It's a picture of the depth of the unraveling that we are possibly facing, that he would argue that we are facing. And we've talked from the beginning of these calls about the time between worlds, where an old world, an old order is going away and a new one is coming, and we don't know what it is, and we're in the middle. And his is a deeply grounded validation of that, and disturbing for me, and supports the folks who say it's time to study collapsology, that it's just like, doomed, it's over, nothing to do but pull up the ladders, hunker down, and do your best by yourself. But this is not the first time humans have lived through massive disruption and perhaps collapse of societies. People have lived in them and have lived through them, through tumultuous and apocalyptic times. I heard last week on KPFA an interview with a writer named John Vaillant, did a book called Fire Weather. And it's, even for somebody like me who pays a lot of attention to climate issues, it was a chilling listen about the scale of the fire future that we're facing. He talked in particular about what happens when you build homes that have a lot of petroleum products in them, vinyl siding, plastic furniture, synthetic countertops, et cetera. And when a firestorm approaches, before the fire gets to the house, from maybe a quarter mile away, there's 1,000-degree heat front moving forward. And that heat front reaches the houses, and the petroleum products start to volatilize, and they give off flammable gases. And at some point, the house just goes, and it's gone in 3 to 5 minutes, an entire building down to the ground. There's that. So he's going through this litany of holy crap. And then at the end said this, what I thought was remarkable. He said a remarkable thing. He said, what an amazing time to be alive. How thrilling it is that we're in a moment where we will have to reinvent everything. I thought, wow, what a way to frame it. In the terror is an opportunity that doesn't come very often. A willingness to reinvent everything doesn't come very often. Across the bay from me, 119 years ago, San Francisco went down to the ground in the 1904 earthquake, and it had to be rebuilt in its entirety. What does it look like to rebuild everything in its entirety, hopefully before it goes down to the ground? So, in that context, and I think this echoes what Solnit has said, hope is not a prediction. It's not a declaration that everything is going to be all right. It's a stance. It's an orientation. It's a way of being in the world, committed to something. It's a commitment, not a prediction. And as such, it's a kind of power, I will say. And we haven't talked about power for a while. It's there in the subtitle of this series, Living Between Worlds with Grace and Dignity and Power. And power is a funny thing. Folks on the left don't like to talk about power very much. We're democratic. We don't like hierarchy, but power isn't just about power over. The physics definition of power is the ability to do work. It's power to. The sociologist Michael Mann, not the climatologist Michael Mann, but the sociologist Michael Mann, in his book Sources of Social Power, identifies 4 principal sources of power as being control over economic, ideological, military, and political resources. Some of those are out of our hands as individual people. Some of them are not. So let me stop there. I see a couple of hands. Let me just offer the general question is, what does both the Solnit reading and what I just spoke provoke for you? In terms of mood, in terms of ideas, in terms of directions, where do you want to go with this? We'll talk together for, Ken, what, about 10 minutes, 10 or 12 minutes, then we'll go into breakouts and dive a little bit deeper into some more specific questions. So I've got Mary and Stuart and Shell queued up. Mary, go ahead. Do you have, if you can, turn your camera on, we'd love to see you, but if not, it's okay. But do turn your mic on. Okay, Mary, we'll go on to Stuart and come back to you if you can get your mic going. Stuart?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say the idea of hope, okay? Sitting around and hoping it's going to get better. It can be extremely deceptive, and I just wanted to point out that my what I like to think of is Joanna Macy's frame, you know, activist hope. In other words, yeah, hope for something better, but also take action as kind of a critical point linking with hope. It's just like sitting around and praying that things are going to get better. No, do something, do something. So I just wanted to add that into the mix.
Thank you. Shell?
Yeah, I often use the phrase optimistic creativity, and I think the Solnit piece was loaded with that. I always find her writing to be very inspirational, in part because she is able to see that people's movements change things. And so many people just give us this litany of, oh, woe is me, the world is falling apart, Chicken Little. And I have always built my activism on the idea that I don't always know when it's going to be, but sometimes I make a difference. And sometimes we as people's movements make a difference. I've been lucky enough to be part of a few that were successful, or successful for a while, like in the case of the safe energy movement of the 1970s, fighting against nuclear power. We have to do that again. In the case of abortion rights and reproductive rights, we have to do it again. But, you know, 40, 50 years, these movements had a victory. And it turned out to be more temporary than we thought, but it was still a victory. I used a lot of optimistic creativity in starting the movement that saved the mountain very close to my house from a horrible, horrible trophy home development.
So, you know, history is filled with these examples. The mainstream media is not filled with these examples. It's not an accident, I would say.
No, it's not. But there's so much media out there that, from Yes Magazine to the various Good News newsletters, it's easy to surround yourself with what's going on that's great.
And we want to go there a bit more in this call. Thank you. Mary, do you still want to take a shot and get your mic on? Maybe not. Others, what are these questions provoking for you? Mark, go ahead, please. We'll need your mic on, though.
We can do it, and thank you. First of all, the different arenas you mentioned are all linked together, and they may it's a partial and loose linking, but it's a linking with enormous potential. So that once we start making changes economically, and we're doing it in collaboration with the movement, which is what I'm trying to do, then we unleash political power, and the political power unleashes the opportunity to complete the technological and economic changes. And those things can create a virtuous cycle as well as a vicious cycle. So we have to learn what the difference is and how to make it go one direction instead of the other.
Thanks, Mark. The other linkage there, of course, is the ideological power.
Yeah.
The beliefs, the conversations that we have, the ideas that sustain a culture, which is a place where we are all able to act in ways that we can't, obviously, militarily. We can only do to some extent economically. So how, and this is one of the reasons that we focus so much in these conversations about how we speak with each other and how we speak with ourselves, because that's one of the realms of ideological power. So thank you for that, George, and then Randy. Welcome, Randy.
Yeah. There's another source of power, which I don't think man mentions.
Okay.
But that's your own power, moving from your own center, finding what your center is, and then moving from that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the beginning of all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Social, economic, political, military. You have to have your own center first. A friend of mine emailed me the other day, like other friends now, getting freaked out about climate.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, we should put together a conference that would be able to do something afterwards. And I see electoral politics and many things like we have to do this first in order to be able to do the next thing that we actually want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more of a direct action guy.
Mm-hmm.
When I was involved in anti-nuclear work, what we were doing was an energy show talking about insulation and solar and the alternatives all throughout New England for about 2.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to see a similar thing happening through farmers markets so that we could change the energy structure within a year. At this point in time, the television media that I see is beginning to take climate seriously. It's beginning to lead the news almost every day because it has to.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also like to see them focus on practical, replicable actions that people are taking around the world now in such a way that the viewers could take them and make them happen within their own communities. We need to do this, and we need to do this quickly because, as probably everybody on this call knows, we passed the point of no return.
Randy.
Yes, thank you, Gil. I'm in Philadelphia and I just drove down. We have a place in Ontario. And so I was following the smoke from the fires in Canada. And I think that it really is raising awareness. Like we need more raising of awareness, but no more evidence. People are really thinking like, wow, this can change the weather in Philadelphia. So I think to me, hope is a state of mind which allows you to take action. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of the Gospel of Luke. I always think of Luke as hope and healing. You know, he did healing. He didn't just hope that Christ was coming back or whatever. It was about healing. It was about taking action. And I did want to mention one wonderful TED Talk I saw just recently that gave me a lot of hope. It was by Alan Shapiro about stopping the desertification around the world. It was just about 17 minutes or so. Mm-hmm. And I know he's been doing this work for 30 years. So it's a shame that he hasn't gotten a lot more attention, but it's really, really worth watching. I've been telling everybody about it if you want hope.
Thank you. If you can put a link in the chat, if you have it, that would be great.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Hank.
Yeah, I've worked with the concept of hope quite a lot. And I put in the chat, hope is an active verb. I also was happy that Stuart mentioned Joanna Macy's active hope, because that's the only type of hope that ever will lead to doing things. And I liked, Gil, your citation of from the book about the fire watcher, was it? That
fire weather.
Fire weather, that it's a gift to be alive in this moment because we have the opportunity now to reframe everything. And after that, you said yes, and in the terror comes this opportunity. And I think that's really a very important thing to keep in mind. There are a lot of people in Western countries, in Western Europe, probably in North America as well, who are totally stressed out, especially young people have experience a lot of stress, whether it relates to climate stress or various other things in their environment. So I think it's very important that there are groups of people like this one here and some others that I know Gil and Stuart and Ken are involved with, that actually are ready to pick up this challenge of finding the opportunity to help the world rethink everything. So I thought that's worth mentioning again, worth underlining and marking with yellow and green markers.
Thank you. We'll take Stuart and Mark real briefly, and then we're going to move into breakouts. Gentlemen, Stuart?
Yeah, quickly, I just put a link in the chat. I just read an article about climate therapy. Real important for young people who are looking out at the world and seeing, oh my God, what am I stepping into? What's the future going to look like? And managing themselves psychologically and emotionally around that.
Thank you. Mark?
And there is a latent project for designing knowledge bases to design sustainable economies and implement and manage them. And there's Tim Forsman is the world-class expert on that. And I'm a friend of his and we're on the same page about it. And I've been working on my design for about 45 years too. And then there's another guy who can handle the technical frame underneath, Chris Richardson.
If you could share links in the chat, that would be great. On the way into breakouts, Rebecca Solnit posted last night, she said, acknowledging that there are enemies of hope. There are folks who are propagating despair and surrender for many different reasons. And what she said is that what all these enemies of hope have in common is confidence about what is going to happen, a false certainty that excuses inaction. Not acting, Solnit says, is a luxury those in immediate danger do not have, and despair is something they cannot afford. Climate defeatism is a form of destructive emission that needs to be capped, especially when coming from the comfortable homes in the global north. It's us. Ken, take us into breakouts for another layer of discussion about this.
Okay. So we touched a little bit on doomism and collapsology, which I think are great terms, and they really rub me the wrong way because it does tend to dissuade a lot of people from taking action. So what we'd like to know is, I'm going to put this in the chat now. Hold on one second. In the midst of doomism and collapsology, where are you focusing your energies? How do you stay resilient and on purpose in the face of the barrage of bad news that assaults us every single day? So we happen to have an even number of people, 32. So we're going to have 8 breakout rooms of 4 people each. I'm going to open them now. We'll have, what do you think, Gil, about 18 minutes in this one? Sound good?
Let's do, yeah, that should work.
All right, 18 minutes. Here you go. Enjoy. Thank you all. Hope that was a good session for you. It certainly was for the group I was in. Before we move to the next room, let's just hear a couple of reports. Anybody hear something that surprised them or delighted them or moved them? No? Boring groups? Thanks, Stuart. Nobody wants to share anything? Gene, please.
Joe Redstone and I got off on the thinking of Daniel Schmachtenberger and his idea that underlying all of this is the way we have our entire societies and our entire world set up, that we're separate, we're rivals, and therefore we're in rivalrous relationships, plus exponential tech, which is growing faster and faster. And as rivals, we're always trying to externalize cost and internalize profits. And we are in what he calls we're connected in a competitive relationships with everybody, a multi-channel risk that can only be avoided by, I think, living simply and living together for each other rather than seeing ourselves separate, is seeing ourselves as all together and living from there. Difficult to do. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gene. Jan.
Yeah, I just, since I went to the Walter Russell Museum in Waynesboro, Virginia last fall and spent a week there and learned about the Twilight Club that met in New York City starting in the 1870s. And I just didn't share this in the breakout, but one of the most inspiring stories in the Twilight Club is that in 1895, this young woman, Sophie Irene Loeb, showed up at 19 years old, sitting in a mansion living room with all the most famous people in the world at that time. And they got behind her, and she had grown up in the orphanages and had been part of the orphanage sweatshop enslavement of children that was going on in the uptown part of New York in the 1880s and 1890s, in the industrial complex, where these kids were just being worked and lived in these orphanages. And it was just a horror. And very few people really understand the degree to which New York City had that going on. And, you know, these guys got behind this young woman, and she wrote articles, and they eliminated sweatshops, and they eliminated orphanages, and they just started reinventing our society out of this group that met at Twilight in New York, facilitated by a spiritual adept named Walter Russell. And I just, at that time, things were really bad for people, for most people, and New York was a cesspool. And Teddy Roosevelt's mother and wife died on the same day because of the unsanitary conditions, and he was sick his whole childhood because he lived in New York. And so, you know, that was a time when it was really, really looking bad. And a group of people just got together and they came up with the Poets Code, and they empowered Sophie Irene Loeb and many other people, and they literally reinvented our society over a multi-decade period through these conversations and embedding the Poets Code into our lives. And I just have gotten a tremendous amount of inspiration from the fact that occurred, and also fascinating fact that no one has ever, I mean, I do a straw poll right here. How many people know the name Walter Russell? Nobody knows about this guy who was like Leonardo to the fourth power, who really reinvented our whole world with his friends, and nobody knows anything about it. It's really fascinating.
I would add to the
stories of
yeah, Jan, thank you. I'd add to that, looking at the demise of the sweatshops, it was not just a bunch of leadership people propagating messages, but it was also unions and people out in the street, and strikes, and frankly, political violence.
And the Triangle Waste Fire.
Against working people and Triangle Waste, you know, the fires.
You're breaking up.
I guess I am. Ken, take it over. I'll fix my.
I think I was talking to you. There was that Triangle Shirtwaist Fire factory where they had locked all the people inside to keep them from going on breaks, and like 180 women and children died. That was a huge, horrible thing that just motivated people to take action. We're going to move on to the next breakout room. So we have another question for you, which is now we want to focus on you personally. How do you orient in these times? What do you look for nourishment, inspiration, roadmaps? What are you seeing that's encouraging? What's keeping you grounded in the mood of possibility? So I've got some, read on the breakout as a new people, and we'll again have 18 minutes, and we're going to go. All right, welcome back. Well, I had a great breakout room, but I'm not going to hog the mic here. Let me open it up, and who'd like to share what they heard? Who's found something inspiring or touching? Bill Anderson, please.
Yeah, the group I was in, what came up for me, which I hadn't known about, was focusing oriented psychotherapy, because I threw out a psychoanalytical little something I read in a book by Martha Nussbaum. So it was very something to look into. It was intriguing.
Bill, is that connected with Eugene Gendlin's book, Focusing?
Yeah, and the reference is in the chat.
Go.
Yeah, we had a great discussion. It was Randy and Catherine and Dawn and me on creativity, on the art's role in social change, and also in the generational passing of knowledge, and how can young people get inspired when they haven't had the life experience that gives people who've been around through the movement for a while more hope. Really good discussion. And for those who, like me, weren't able to find the raise hand button at first, it's hiding under more. It's not under reactions today.
It's different places for different people. For me, it's all out by itself. So go figure.
Right, but that's because you have your screen expanded enough for the bottom to be seen. If your screen's smaller,
there you go.
Go into more.
Mysteries of Zoom.
Klaus, please.
Yeah, I was just struck with the concept of local engagement, right? I mean, this is we pretty much know the types of changes that we need to engage with, and we may not have a real handle on how to engage locally and where to get in, but for sure the temptation to find techno solutions, to get inventions and techno ideas to solve this here is tempting, but it's just really misleading. And I'm in the food business, right? And the idea, for example, that we can overcome the challenge of raising meat in such destructive ways by doing this through fermented meats and cellular growth meats, it's just not going to happen. The investments that would be required to build any level of capacity that would make an impact, you're talking 10, 20, 30 years in the future. I mean, just think about the billions of animals that we process on an annual basis. To replace anywhere near that capacity is virtually impossible. So we need to be realistic, and there is far more we can achieve with personal consumption changes, changing our consumption patterns and adapting in that way. That has an instant impact, and it costs nothing, right? And it doesn't take any kind of investment. So it's just these nature-based solutions, I think, should be our focus.
Thank you, Klaus. Felix.
Well, we had a discussion that got back to hope in a different way, which was what can we do to give ourselves permission to hope for and make our goals what we really know we want? Or are we going to settle for what the whole climate movement basically says, which is work the rest of our lives to avoid the worst consequences or slow down what's coming? Can we actually give ourselves a vision of the world we want and talk about that, give that, motivate young people with that. Currently, my group is in conversations with Tony Seba, who gives a picture of a lot of ways the world could change much more quickly than anyone imagines. And on the last question, I think a vision of the world without eating meat is a combination of change in personal actions and a huge amount of evolution of society, infrastructures, and technology and solutions. So I think that the combination of behavioral change and new technologies are going to give a lot of people hope that we can actually have a better world.
Thank you, Felix. Mark.
Well, first, yay for Tony Seba. And then our group talked about youth and older people being able to provide insight and inspiration, even if we don't have as much energy. And talk about youth, and one point was made that youth are not turning conservative as they pass 35 anymore. And then we also talked about blessed unrest, like thousands of categories of millions of groups who are all working together. It reminds me of the statement that 34% of the population thought it was me and my 6 friends. That came out of the cultural creative studies. So that's just a few points.
Thank you, Mark. I'm curious to know if anybody in your small groups brought up anything around learning from First Nations and Indigenous peoples, tapping their wisdom.
I'm sorry, Ken, could you speak more clearly?
Your sound is soft and kind of muddy, Ken.
Okay, hold on. I'm dialed in.
Better.
I'm actually checking through my hearing aids. Better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm curious to know if anybody in your small groups brought up learning from First Nations peoples, drawing on indigenous wisdom traditions, because that's a completely different worldview. And I hear a lot of people who look like me talking about what we're going to do, rather than what can we learn from people who've been living in continuous community for 40 or 60,000 years. Anybody touch on that in your groups? Okay, if you didn't, just a question.
It's a tradition well worth looking into if you have not. A couple of remarkable books as possible starting points are Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and Sand Talk by, Ken, give me the last name. I don't have it in my head.
Tyson Yunkaporta.
And we'll put those in the chat. And there's, this is a tiny slice of the resources that are available. And for those of you who haven't looked at it yet, The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, which gives you a very different perspective on the last 50,000 years of human history and who we are and what we do. I found it one of the most richly encouraging things that I've read in a very, very long time.
Stuart, who had to leave us, raised this in the first small group, and I think Don and Catherine hinted at it in the second one.
Thank you.
I interviewed Tom Hartman a week ago, and he highly praised it and quoted it.
And Hartman's got a new book out, by the way. People should check it out.
Yeah, it's quite something. The Hidden History of American Democracy, in which he traces our roots in Native American and indigenous political societies.
Louis Henry Morgan wrote about that a long time ago in League of the Iroquois, back in the mid-19th century. One of the things that I do is energy and other events monthly, and I'm going to prepare my next for August. And one of the things that I've found is around the world, people are beginning to have discussions about indigenous knowledge and what that means. I was at a lunch with some friends on Saturday, one of whom was a young landscaper. And when I said, "Oh, do you do anything with permaculture?" She said, "Oh, you mean how they took the Aboriginal knowledge and presented it as white people knowledge?" So,
well, you know,
Bill
there's
Mollison.
an interesting dilemma there, George, because on the one hand, there's that, and on the other hand, we want that knowledge out in the world widely, and widely shared and widely used. So there you go. Klaus, back to you.
Yeah, on this topic of indigenous, what would you say to a Japanese farmer who is following practices that have been established over some 4,000 years, who have been able to live on their land without destroying their soil, and maintains soil health and viability and the ability to feed their population? Same is true for Germany, Greece, France. You know, the Europeans have been farming there since before the Roman Empire and maintained the viability of their soil. So I think this indigenous, we understand indigenous as indigenous people, but there is indigenous wisdom in cultures and cuisines around the world, you know, who have successfully maintained their viability on their land, which is unlike what we're doing in the US, where we already have destroyed, you know, some 40% of our topsoil, 50% of our watersheds are polluted beyond being able to fish or recreate in it. So just a perspective on what is indigenous.
Klaus, what I would say to people who've been farming land for 4,000 years sustainably, I would say thank you. Yeah.
And what I would offer is directly from Tyson's book, Sandtalk. He says, for the purposes of the thought experiments in this book, an indigenous person is a member of a community retaining memories of a life lived sustainably on a land base. As part of that land base, indigenous knowledge is any application of those memories as living knowledge to improve present and future circumstances. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a particular shade of skin, but rather if you are connected to the earth in that way where you're living sustainably, Tyson says that's indigenous. Catherine, please.
And thank you. And then Jan and Mitch, and we're coming close to the end of our 90 minutes. So if you please keep your comments brief and focused, that would be great.
Yeah, really, I was just going to reiterate what Ken spoke to, which is we all have intimate and immediate access to the greatest indigenous teacher of all, and that's Mama Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So finding ways to connect with her in really powerful ways is always there as an invitation and as a practice.
An invitation to all of us to get outside.
Thank you, Catherine. John?
Yeah, I just am reminded from this conversation of just had a meeting with the chief purpose officer at Traditional Medicinals. And I don't know how many of you know of this company, but this company has gone around the planet. It's the leading medicinal tea company in the world. And their whole business model is to restore indigenous cultures around particular kinds of plants, gypsy cultures in India, all over the planet. They have been revitalizing indigenous communities to create a commons-based global supply chain of the highest quality medicinal plants on the planet. And all of them come from these indigenous communities that have been doing this for thousands of years, that this company very proactively is regenerating at an astonishing level of stewardship. If I find that hopeful that this here.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Doing that for
Mitch and Doc, and then I'm going to
decades.
turn it over to Gil to end. So if you can keep it brief, please.
I often find indigenous as a word or a way of describing something is presented as a division between us and them. And what I would love to see everybody thinking about is how do we become indigenous, which is to recognize that we are part of a system and then to become comfortable with it. The communities that we refer to as indigenous are also migrants too, because we all came from one small part of the world and spread out. How did they become indigenous to those places? That's the secret we need to understand. It's not exactly how they practiced. It's how did they become that way so that we become that way in relationship to the world we are in today.
Yeah, nicely said, Mitch. Peter Berg had a publication called Planet Drum some 50 years ago out of San Francisco, which talked a lot about re-inhabiting. not just moving into a place, but becoming of that place. Wendell Berry goes into this in another way, Tyson in another way, but belonging to a place, belonging to land, ecosystem, community, to the living world. For me, that's become increasingly part of the key to the door that we're trying to open here. Doc, over to you.
Yes, well, I've had conversations with a few indigenous people about this in some depth, and the conclusion usually reached is they too cannot return to the way their forefathers lived. Now there's too much technology, there's too much destruction, there are too many people in the world who can't do exactly what they did. We've got a challenge unlike any other in humanity's past to cut way back and let nature restore itself as best we can. And we really don't know how to do that very well. So it's a big learning project for everybody.
But we may
Thinking
learn.
like indigenous people certainly going to help.
Yep. Doc, thank you. We may actually learn something. The European Union just this week promulgated a new, I don't know if it's a regulation or a commitment or something, some policy thing, talking about rewilding 20% of the land and marine areas in Europe. I mean, you think about, I don't know what the details are, some of you may know more, but just on the face of it, it's a stunning declaration and a step in the direction, Doc, that you're speaking about. So golly, thank you all for an exceptionally rich call and conversation. I appreciate each and every one of you, both what you've shared here on the call and what I know or don't know about what you do in the world. One thing struck me in the some of the breakouts that I listened to, just noticing how easy it is for us to fall into, if not the despair, into the diagnoses of the mess. It's very easy for us to focus on and talk about what's wrong, what's missing, what's not working, what they're doing, what we don't like. And not that there's anything wrong with that. We do that. But in the breakouts I was in, the conversations started a little bit there, but then moved into what are people doing? Where are people grounded? What are people drawing inspiration from? What are we seeing that's working? And the flavor, the mood, if you will, the physical texture, the energy, the spirit, the creativity in the conversation is a very different thing. So my invitation for all of us is that we be aware of that. Notice how we move between those two realms, between those two postures and stances. There is room for the criticism. In fact, diagnosing the system is one of the important parts of the work that we have to do, to understand where the breakdowns are, where the weak points are, where the leverage is. But part of the work that we have to do is to bring ourselves forward into this in a spirit of, well, as I said earlier in the call, and hope as a stance, not as a prediction. Hope is a commitment. Joanna Macy beautifully said, there's no word for hope in the Buddhist tradition, perhaps because it takes you out of the present moment. So here we are. And as that other great sage, Charles Schwab, the senior, once said, the best place to start is where you are with what you have. And so may we all do that and do that fruitfully. We'll hope to see you next month, same time, same place. We again invite you to invite other people. Help us enrich the conversation. We would love to have more diversity of voices. Ken and I do what we can to broaden the invite, but each of you knows people who would welcome being in this conversation, who could bring something to it, perhaps bring very different experience than you or we do. Ken, I see your finger pointing to the sky.
Along those lines, I'd like to ask, I know several of you have children and grandchildren, and Gil and I have tossed around this idea of having an intergenerational conversation on this channel. So if you think it would be possible to invite children or grandchildren, hopefully at least teenagers, I don't know that the young people, really young kids would do well, but it'd be awesome to have a real, genuine intergenerational conversation here. And if it turns out that we can only do that if we did it on a weekend, let us know. But we're interested in doing this. So please think about that. And if you'd be willing to do that, let us know. We'd really love to try that out.
Okay. Again, thank you all for coming. And as always, we will ask Brandy Carlisle to play us out. The song is The Eye. The chorus is, you can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. It's a wonderful summary of the conversations that we've been having these last 4 years. Look it up, listen to the whole thing. It's a gorgeous piece of work, and carry that in your hearts. We'll see you next time.
You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye.